Carolyn Janney will present Returning to the Field of Glory, Veterans at Gettysburg. Carolyn Janney is an associate professor of history at Purdue University. Her first book, Burying the Dead But Not the Past, Ladies' Memorial Associations and the Lost Cause, explores the role of white Southern women as the creators and purveyors of Confederate tradition in the immediate post-Civil War South. Her newest book, Remembering the Civil War, Reunion and the Limits of Reconciliation, published just last month, studies the ways in which Unionists and former Confederates attempted to reconcile after the war. It examines the role of veterans associations, women's clubs, monument dedications, efforts to establish national battlefields, and Hollywood's treatment of the war. The book also elaborates on the ways in which Americans used the memory of the war to shape the United States culture and politics for more than 100 years after the surrender at Appomattox. A former fellow at the Huntington Library and the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, she's currently a fellow at Purdue University's Center for Humanistic Studies. Please welcome Dr. Carolyn Janney.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming out today on this nice, humid day. I will warn everyone ahead of time that I'm usually a wanderer, so if I start to wander from the podium, I will try my best to stay next to it. Thank you to the Gettysburg Foundation, to the Trust, to the Park for inviting me to speak to you today. What I'm going to be talking about is the way in which veterans, and specifically Union veterans, thought about this battlefield in particular in the years after the war. We'll start with 1895. By 1895, Gettysburg was quite the tourist destination already. There were battlefield books, battlefield guides that were being produced en masse. And a man by the name of Luther Minge published many of these. He was a battlefield guide, a battlefield lecturer. And in 1895, he described the battlefield as, quote, the greatest as well as the most important battle in the War of the Rebellion. From every portion of this country, he wrote, come yearly thousands upon thousands of people to visit this sacred field. Here veterans who wore the blue and the gray often mingle, not as they once did in deadly combat, but sadly remembering the past. They clasp hands, and in doing so, honor to the valiant and heroic dead who fell here. Gettysburg has therefore become, he wrote, and is the Mecca of American reconciliation. Now, since that time, countless others, including guidebook writers, scholars, have also pointed to Gettysburg, have pointed to the battlefield and the town as proof of a reunited and reconciled nation. And images of reunions at Gettysburg, I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these images of old veterans clasping hands. In 1913, pictures from the 1938 reunion. Images of these reunions have abounded. They've promoted the notion that veterans were able to come back together and reminisce on the battle, forgetting the bitterness of the war, or that they were able to forgive their former enemies for their transgressions, or at the very least, that these veterans agreed to remain silent on the issues that had divided them so fiercely in 1861, 63, 65, most especially on the topic of slavery. But these images of harmonious blue-gray reunions, of these men clasping hands, these images that you see before you, did not necessarily reflect the feelings of most veterans. Instead, for more than 75 years, veterans came back here to this town, to this field, and saw it as a site of contested memory, a site of bitter feelings, and at least one instance, continued violence among the veterans and their children. Most Union veterans, and Confederate veterans for that matter, saw Gettysburg first and foremost as a Union memorial park, not a national memorial park, but a Union memorial park dedicated to the memory of the soldiers in blue who fought and died here. Many, if not most, of the veterans of the Army of the Potomac were not ready to forget the acrimony. We're not ready to forget the vehemence of the past, even if they did agree to shake hands over the so-called bloody chasm. Most Union veterans did not try to appease their former enemies by forgetting what the war was about, especially when it came to the topic of slavery. So today what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit about the contentious battles that continued to take place after the battle here in 1863. The battles over how the veterans elected to remember this sacred site. So I'll talk first about efforts to preserve the field, the initial efforts to preserve the field. I'll talk about reunions of the blue and the gray soldiers in 1887, 1913, 1938. And we'll also talk about how this was really and truly a Union Memorial Park well before it ever became a site of reconciliation. We'll start with preserving the field. Here's an image that you can see from 1865, not the best image in the world, but you can see the field here. Efforts to preserve the battlefield, to memorialize it, began in the weeks after the battle. In late July, representatives from all the northern states who had had soldiers who fought on the field had an informal meeting to discuss what they should do about the Union dead that remained on or near the field. They quickly formed an association, purchased several acres of land near Evergreen Cemetery, and went on to create what has become now the National Cemetery. Overseeing the interments was Gettysburg physician Samuel Weaver, and it was his job, along with those who worked for him, to meticulously examine every corpse to ensure that no rebel would rest next to an honorable Union soldier. The Confederate dead were instead left to decompose in the mass graves throughout the battlefield where they had been left in the weeks after the battle. This is a quote from a veterans magazine in December 65 talking about Gettysburg National Cemetery. It said, "None but loyal soldiers for the Union lie here. This intermingling of states in the ashes of the dead is itself a symbol and a prophecy of the reality and the perpetuity of that Union which was here redeemed and sealed by so much precious blood." So no Confederate soldier was to be buried in the National Cemetery. Along with creating the National Cemetery, which of course would become enshrined by Lincoln's words here in November of 1863, that summer a group of men also went about preserving the field itself. They created the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, the efforts led by local attorney David McConaughey. By August, McConaughey and this association had purchased several portions of the field, including the heights of Cemetery Hill, a granite spur on Round Top, and portions of Culp's Hill. And by 1864, and keep in mind, by 1864, no one really knows how this war is going to end. We can speculate. Well, we're not going to talk about Gettysburg as a turning point of the war. I'm sure you've heard ad nauseum about that. But by 1863, certainly by 1864, the war is not over. And here they're taking efforts to preserve the field. That's really important for us to keep in mind, that this is a Union effort first and foremost. 1864, the field is created, quote, "to commemorate the heroic deeds, the struggles and triumphs of the Union's brave defenders. Let it be the shrine of loyalty and patriotism," declared the association, "whither in all times will come the sons of America and the pilgrims of all lands to view with wonder and veneration the sacred scenes of heroic struggles in which were involved the life of the nation and the perpetuity of liberty." Here they are sanctifying the Union cause on this battlefield. In the following years, in the years after the war, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association would improve the field for tourists. Tourists were flocking to the town, even in 1863. They're rebuilding the Union works. They're placing wooden placards along key battlefield locations. They're arranging several dozen condemned cannons on the field so that people have something to see when they come here to the field. And in the 1870s, the veterans decided that it wasn't enough simply to mark the lines, but they wanted to start to build monuments on the field. Up until the 1870s, the monuments that had been erected throughout the country were, for the most part, done in cemeteries. They were funerary in design. But in the 1870s, the veterans proposed and began to erect monuments on the field. The first of which was dedicated on August 1st, 1878. Brigadier General Strong Vincent's men dedicated a tablet to their commander on the southern slope of Little Round Top, where he had fallen mortally wounded. The following year, 1879, the 2nd Massachusetts would follow, erecting a monument to the men of their regiment who had fallen at Spangler's Meadow. And as they geared up for the 25th anniversary of the battle, regiment after regiment is anticipating dedicating a monument on the field. I'm sure any of you who have spent any time on this field will note that you can't move 5 inches without running into a regimental marker. This is what these men are creating in the 1870s, 1880s. They would create camps like this. The image you see before you is a GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest Union veterans organization. GAR units would raise money for they weren't necessarily organized by the regiment, but they would come here finding the lines where their comrades had fought, and they're raising money to create these regiments. By 1884, the legislatures of loyal states, of the Union states, began providing funding for each unit that had fought at Gettysburg. And within 2 years, by 1886, more than 100 tablets and monuments had been dedicated. And the monuments were so important here because they allowed the Army of the Potomac to memorialize their first decisive victory of the war. And we can talk about Antietam a little bit, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that Gettysburg is the first real triumph for the Army of the Potomac. This is a battle that they can commemorate. This is the first time they can say that they have squarely beaten Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and they want to commemorate this field. This is the beginning for the Army of the Potomac. This is where this notion of Gettysburg as a turning point comes about. Veterans of the Army of the Potomac are saying, hey, this is the beginning of that inevitable victory over treason. And in countless monument dedications, these veterans heralded Gettysburg as the death knell of the rebellion. I'll share a few quotes with you. John S. Strange, a member of the 104th New York, observed that the battle was historic in that it marked, quote, the beginning of the overthrow of treason and rebellion. A.N. Mills, another veteran, concurred, noting simply that the rebellion was inaugurated at Charleston in 1861, culminated at Gettysburg in 1863. So these men see Gettysburg as that decisive moment. What's important for us to keep in mind, though, is that this is not the Gettysburg that the guidebooks are talking about, of this Mecca of reconciliation. Instead, the marble, the granite, the bronze statuary that was erected here in the 1870s and 1880s was dedicated to preserving the memory of Union soldiers and the Union cause. There were to be no Confederate memorials. Now, there is a memorial to the 2nd Maryland, a small little monument, a regimental marker. That was actually a huge offense to many of the Union soldiers. They saw this as a place to remember their cause, their veterans. This is, again, exclusively a Union memorial park at this point. Here we have some of the images of the regimental monuments being erected. The notion that this is a Union park was clear at the first blue-gray reunion held here on the field. Carol Reardon has written an excellent book about Pickett's Charge and Myth and Memory. I recommend it to any of you that have not read it. And she talks about this first reunion in 1887. It was at that point that Confederate veterans of General George V. Pickett's division agreed to meet with some of their former adversaries of General Alexander Webb's Philadelphia Brigade. Excuse me. But tensions among the veterans nearly thwarted the reunion. This reunion almost didn't happen at all. Some Virginians, for their part, openly questioned the loyalty of any former Confederate who would agree to attend a reunion here at Gettysburg. Debates among Union veterans were even more visceral. Reports that the rebels would place a marker behind Union lines at the so-called high water mark caused an outcry among Northern veterans. John Backelder of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association received, quote, bushels of letters opposing any such memorial. Governor Joseph Foraker of Ohio threatened to use the Ohio National Guard to prevent any such sacrilege. This is to place a monument on the field. Well, given this animosity, and you have to imagine this is going back and forth through the newspapers, many Virginians simply say, forget it. We're not going. We're not going to attend it all. If this is how it's going to be, if they're not going to welcome us with open arms, if they're not going to tell us how much they love us when we go up there, we're not going to attend at all. In the end, there's a concession to mark the spot reached by Pickett's men during their now famous charge, and they agree, a handful of them agree to attend. On July 2nd, 1887, 500 Philadelphia Brigade veterans and their families arrived in Gettysburg to welcome some 200 former foes. Sally Pickett, the widow of George Pickett, would be there on the field that day welcoming the veterans of both sides. As a sidebar, she would get so much fame at this point that she would not only change her name from Sally to the more formal-sounding LaSalle Pickett, but she also would shave a few years off her life, describe herself as the child bride of Pickett. She starts concocting all sorts of stories at this moment. She becomes very famous in doing so. So she really is a career widow, if there ever was a career to be had by being a widow. Anyway, that's the 24th anniversary. 25th anniversary, the very next year, would offer even more evidence of the lingering sectional bitterness that existed. Many Union veterans, for their part, were increasingly angry that when people talked about Gettysburg, they talked about Pickett's charge. They said, hey, what about the rest of us? What about the fact that the Union won this battle? Why is all the emphasis on Pickett's charge? Many were growing increasingly angry that Pickett's charge was eclipsing the role of the Union veterans. One Union veteran counseled former Confederates that, quote, the hallowed field of Gettysburg is no place to vaunt treason and glorify rebellion. And he was perfectly content that the ex-rebels, quote, stay at home and gnaw on the file of discontent and obscurity. And in fact, many of them did. While nearly 20,000 Union veterans attended the 25th reunion in 1888, most Confederates decided to stay home. So it was not a blue-gray reunion, so to speak, in 1888. By the 1890s, then, Gettysburg was clearly a Union Memorial Park. There were more than 400 Union markers at Gettysburg, marking not only the Union position physically on the field, but if we look at the monument dedications, if we listen to the words spoken at the monument dedications, we'll find that it was clear that there had been a right side and a wrong side at the battle as well. I'm going to give you a couple examples of some of the speeches that were delivered at these monument dedications. In 1888, addressing the Grand Army of the Republic atop Little Round Top, General J.P.S. Goben declared that he was, for one, quote, tired of this gush and pretense for the glorification of the veteran simply because he wore a gray uniform with a Southern flag printed on its badge. That badge meant treason and rebellion in 1861, and that's what it means now, he said. I want it to be distinctly understood now and for all time, and he's yelling this at a crowd of veterans out in front of him, that the men who wore the gray were everlastingly and eternally wrong. This is no love fest that's going on. The Confederate cause had not been a noble cause in the eye of these Union veterans. And it had been, according to many of the veterans, chiefly about slavery. At the dedication of the Michigan State Monument in June 1889, Congressman Edward McPherson reminded his fellow veterans that, quote, we fought for union and liberty, and they fought for disunion and slavery. During the New York Day, one orator insisted that, quote, the cause which was substantially decided here was the cause of freedom and justice. We may never forget that behind the Union cause was the cause of unpaid labor, of bartered manhood, of traffic which dealt in human hearts. These men have not forgotten that slavery ignited the war first and foremost. They had not come to Gettysburg to bask in reconciliation. They had not come to recall fondly what the Confederates had fought for. They hadn't come to recall the heroics of their former enemies. They had come to dedicate the monuments and preserve the field in the memory of the Union Army. Now, as a sidebar, should note that because Gettysburg has become such a Union memorial, a Union park by the 1880s, it's for this reason that the first national military park is created at Chickamauga and Chattanooga in 1890. It is very much, it's distinctly a joint effort by former Confederates and Union veterans to create what will be a blue-gray park. Gettysburg is not the first national military park. Chickamauga, Chattanooga is in 1890. It gets its establishing legislation well before, 3 years before Gettysburg gets its. Well, despite this lingering animosity, there was evidence of celebrating the fraternity and reconciliation at Gettysburg. And we actually should see that as we should expect that, rather. After all, the Union cause was first and foremost about bringing the nation back together. Of course, Union veterans want to see that they're shaking hands with their former enemies. And blue-gray reunions offered a great, if not the best, reminder that the nation was once again whole. Now, I want you to keep in mind that we see lots of images of these blue-gray reunions, but we see images of these blue-gray reunions because they were special events. Events like weddings and parades. We take pictures of special events today because they're not the norm. These blue-gray reunions were the equivalent at the time. Most of the time, veterans are going to be going to their local GAR post or their local United Confederate Veteran post. They're not going to be mingling with their former enemies. So there's so much publication and so much hoopla about these blue-gray reunions because they are out of the ordinary. Now, we might pause here and ask why in the world former Confederates would even want to come back to Gettysburg or any other battlefield for that matter, especially where they lost. And I'll offer several possible reasons. The first is that the spirit of reconciliation peaked in the 1890s through about 1910, through about the 50th anniversary of the battle. It was the thing to do. Even when veterans didn't necessarily want to do so, going to a blue-gray reunion was the thing to do, whether it be for political or economic or even social reasons. A great quote that I want to share with you is from Senator Edward Carey Walthouse, a former Confederate general from the Army of the Tennessee. He was asked to participate in the dedication at Chickamauga, Chattanooga in 1895, and this is what he writes to a friend in a private letter. He said, "I am in for a rather conspicuous part in the Chattanooga dedication, though I did my best to dodge it. I am a poor hand at blue-gray gush, but the occasion will require a little of that," he confessed. So they know they have to do it. They know for political reasons, if they're in the Senate or they have a business, they know that it makes sense to participate in these. So that's one reason that veterans might come back. The second is that especially for privates, for everyday veterans, for most of these men, for Union and Confederate veterans, reunions offered a break from the monotony of everyday life. They offered a chance to travel, to reunite with old comrades. And keep in mind, these veterans would have been the celebrities of the day. Even the rank and file, when they show up at these reunions, they are treated as heroes, as celebrities. So of course, if there's an opportunity to go, maybe it makes sense to go. The third reason that Confederates might come back to a site like Gettysburg was validation. Validation of their bravery, if not of the cause. So the fact that they were brave and courageous, even if their cause had not been so in the eyes of Union veterans. Pickett's charge is, of course, the epitome of this. How can you not look at Pickett's charge and see these men as heroic and brave and courageous? The fact that the main event at the Gettysburg reunions was always the clasping of hands over the high water mark is proof of this in and of itself. So 1913, 50th anniversary of the battle, was by far the largest and well-attended blue-gray reunion at Gettysburg, and for that matter, perhaps anywhere. In July, more than 53,000 aging Union and Confederate veterans gathered again amid the sweltering summer heat. More than 100,000 spectators and news correspondents from across the not just the country, but from across the world. They came from England and France as well. Came, and here's the site that many of them would have seen before them, this great tent city where the veterans were being housed. Of course, the great climatic moment of the day, as you might imagine, was the shaking of hands along the stone wall at 3 p.m. on July 3rd, almost exactly 50 years to the minute of Pickett's charge, crowds swarmed to watch the approximately 500 Confederate survivors, now roughly in their mid-70s, march in double column, without arms, across the field where they clasped hands with their former enemies. And reconciliation, here's some of the other events that were going on. Of course, they had to feed the veterans, so here they are eating together. Reconciliation seemed to be the order of the day. Confederate veteran and Virginia Governor William H. Mann declared that, quote, "There is no North and no South, no rebels, no Yanks. All is one great nation." Newspapers from coast to coast are heralding the same thing. Here we are, a reunited country. It's the death of sectionalism, the end of the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line has been wiped off the map, they say. Lots and lots of photographs of this nature taken, of veterans clasping hands, of images that are still used today. Anyone who's watched the Ken Burns documentary will note that the documentary begins and ends with these images of veterans clasping hands. But for more than a few veterans, this was not to be the case. They actively rejected the blue-gray love fest. And when I was going through images here last summer of the reunion, I found quite a few images where you see just the Union veterans by themselves and just the Confederate veterans by themselves. There are plenty of posed pictures of them shaking hands, but a great deal of the time they would have spent here in the camps reminiscing with their former comrades, not necessarily participating in the blue-gray gush. In the months prior to the reunion, several members of the Richmond-based Lee Camp of Confederate veterans had launched a protest against the semi-centennial celebration. I'll read you a quote from St. George T.C. Bryan. "I do not see how any man who came back in April of 1865 to smoking ruins and desolated fields, who fought for existence through 6 bitter years of Reconstruction," keep in mind his emphasis on Reconstruction, "and remembers the wormwood of these days, can celebrate side by side with the victors in our defeat in the most important battle of the war." Dr. Landon R. Mason, also of the R.E. Lee camp, concurred. "Reunions only effect a superficial healing of the sore," he said, "leaving beneath the surface the smarting, irritating pus. I, for one, cannot go to Gettysburg, where the Grand Army will celebrate with festival the battle which broke the backbone of the Confederacy, while we recall it only with tears of deep sorrow." These men had no interest in celebrating their defeat. Even some of those who attended the reunion still carried bitter memories of the war 50 years later. And this was evident in an act of violence that occurred during the reunion. When the son of a Confederate veteran, General R.R. Henry, began criticizing Lincoln at a local hotel, a Union veteran jumps to his feet, defending the martyred president. We have an all-out raucous fight that erupts. Eventually, several men are stabbed during this fight. And so we literally have violence that's still ensuing at the 50th anniversary of this battle. Several African American leaders likewise criticized the reunion. "A reunion of whom?" asked the editor of an African American newspaper. "Only of those who fought for the preservation of the Union and the extinction of human slavery? No," he continued, "it was for those who fought to destroy the Union and perpetuate slavery." So he's angry that Confederate veterans are coming back and being celebrated, and these are men that he says have fought to destroy the Union and perpetuate slavery. So African American leaders many of them are outraged by this. In his estimation, locking hands with former Confederates was essentially the same as endorsing Jim Crow. He was only partially correct, however, because organizers had invited members of the United States colored troops to participate in the reunion. Now, there were no USCT troops here at the battle, but they were invited to attend the reunion. At least 300 black veterans attended the reunion. They were, however, housed in a segregated section of the tent community, so they were not treated equally, that's for sure. White Union veterans had not agreed to forget slavery in the name of national unity, even if they forced their former black comrades, to accept second-rate accommodations and treated them disparagingly. So we have racism and remembering slavery are not the same thing. And I just want to get on my soapbox here for a few minutes and say it was very possible. And in fact, in most cases, white Union veterans very much recalled that the war had been first and foremost about slavery, but that in no way made them racial liberals, that in no way made them want to fight against Jim Crow. The two things weren't the same. And in our minds today, I think we've conflated the two things. So we'll end with another picture of the veterans. How should we best understand the veterans and their relationship to this field? Well, I'd suggest two takeaways. The first is that for most veterans of the Army of the Potomac, for most of those men who had fought at Gettysburg, the field was first and foremost, and would remain in their eyes even after it became a national military park after 1895, was first and foremost a memorial to the Union cause. This had been the site of that Army's first clear victory over Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. It had been sanctified by the National Cemetery and preserved as a memorial only weeks after the battle, before it was clear that the Union cause would triumph. It had already been created and perpetuated as a Union park. In the years that followed the war, Union veterans and their civilian supporters ensured that the field would be dedicated to protecting the memory not only of individual Union soldiers who had lost their lives there, but also to the Union cause as a whole. The second takeaway is that even efforts to come together for reunions, for these blue-gray love fest at the field, 25, even 50 years after the battle, suggested that the bitterness very much remained. So long as the war generation remained alive, so would vestiges of sectional rancor and animosity. There would be one final reunion of the veterans, official reunion, in 1938, 75th anniversary of the battle. Their ranks nearly depleted. Approximately 1,400 Union veterans and 500 Confederate veterans, now roughly in their 90s, gathered for the dedication of the Eternal Flame Memorial, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, and the last reunion of the Blue and the Gray. The dedication would be broadcast live across the country by this newfangled thing called the radio by President Roosevelt. And Roosevelt would describe Gettysburg as a shrine to American liberty. Again, just as they had done in 1913, newspapers would wax nostalgic about how there was no Mason-Dixon line. This is evidence of national reconciliation. But even though they're talking about national reconciliation, the Union cause is never far from the memory of these veterans. Paraphrasing the Union cause, so long championed by Northern veterans, one editorial reminded readers that in a world again threatened with war, as we enter upon World War II, the meaning of Gettysburg is that no sacrifice is too great for the preservation of a united nation and the defense of its priceless guarantees of guaranteed freedom. The Union cause had not been forgotten at Gettysburg, and despite claims that Gettysburg was, and perhaps is, the Mecca of reconciliation, for most Union veterans who visited here in the years after the battle, it remained a memorial to the triumph of the Union cause first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Did your research show any correlation between gushing reconciliation or national reconciliation with the coming of the Spanish-American War?
The Spanish-American War is a really interesting point because often historians point to the Spanish-American War in 1898 as the moment when the United States has been reconciled, certainly reunited, and perhaps even reconciled. And we talk about troops from North and South that are fighting together. People like Joseph Wheeler, former Confederate general, who's now fighting in Cuba. But what I found, what's really interesting, is in many cases, yes, it did endorse reconciliation. And there are countless letters that men are writing, veterans are writing, offering their services. They're offering to form a regiment or brigade, a blue-gray regiment, for example, of some of their now friends who had fought against them during the Civil War. But interestingly enough, what I found was even more endorsement of the lost cause. Confederate veterans, for their part, say, look, now we're fighting along with you. Of course, we were brave and we were honorable. And look, we can all get back together, but you need to acknowledge that we were brave then. So they're not talking about the cause of the war, they're talking about their bravery. But in the aftermath, then they start talking about Reconstruction. And debates over what to do with Cuba, what to do with the Philippines, are very much grounded in debates over what happened in Reconstruction. Should the federal government be involved in telling people of color how to run their governments? Should people of color be involved in making decisions, political decisions in their native nations? There's all sorts of discussions about scallywags and carpetbaggers. So the lost cause actually gets even more rejuvenation from the Spanish-American War. So it's pulling both ways. We have soldiers that are fighting together. There are lots of images in the newspapers that show the fathers of soldiers who died in the Spanish-American War, who the two fathers had fought against each other during the Civil War. And so there's a lot of propaganda that supports reconciliation, but it also very much supports the lost cause, the Confederate memory of the war.
I was on a tour with Troy Harmon about the memorial. He mentioned about a reunion of the Webb's Brigade and veterans of Armistead's brigade, and the result of that became the Armistead Memorial inside the Union line.
Right.
He called that a transcendent moment. How controversial was that monument?
It was incredibly controversial at the time, and I only gave you a few quotes from men in 1887 that are disputing the fact that there's any sort of marker. Many of the Union veterans, and Lucius Fairchild, who's a GAR member, is outraged that there would be any sort of effort to memorialize the Confederate advance. And this is the point of contention, that the former Confederates want the high water mark memorialized, while the Union veterans say, no, you can put something over on Seminary Ridge, but we don't want anything here. So the concession eventually is the tablet that is placed there, but not the scale of the monument that the Virginians, in fact, want. The second Maryland monument that I mentioned that's over on Culp's Hill, that is part of the reason that there's so much animosity in 1887 and especially 1888 by the Union veterans, because they don't want any Confederate, many of them don't want any Confederate markers anywhere on the field.
Reconciliation ultimately takes place, and the story of the war that evolves is largely, even in the North, the Southern version of the war. How do we get there?
How do we get there? So I'm perhaps going to split hairs and say that reunion and reconciliation were two different things. Reunion of the nation happens. It happens either at Appomattox and Durham Station in April of '65, or it happens once the former Confederate states, once their representatives have been readmitted to Congress. But we can all acknowledge that the country was once again reunited. That happens. That's a fact. Reconciliation is a little bit harder to define. And if that is a feeling, a performance, if it's a way of acknowledging that your former enemy, either acknowledging that they were right or acknowledging that you won't talk about what happened, but you agree to be friendly with them. Reconciliation, and many of the veterans talk about this, is fuzzier. It's hard to pin down what reconciliation is. So there are absolutely gestures of reconciliation. There are absolutely these reunions that happen. But whether or not most veterans, Union or Confederate, were willing to forget and forgive, I'm just not sure that really ever happens. So how do we get to the lost cause, the Southern cause becoming kind of the national memory of the war? I think that's the responsibility of the subsequent generations. And a short answer is that a lot of that starts to happen with Gone with the Wind in the wake of World War II, when that next generation, so the grandchildren in many instances of the war generation, it's really with that generation that we start to see this rewriting of history. That's when slavery gets written out of the equation. For people who never lived in a country where slavery threatened to tear the nation apart, it's easy to write slavery out of the equation. But for those veterans and the children of those veterans who knew what a very real threat that was, that doesn't happen. So it's really kind of that post Gone with the Wind, post-1939, post-1940s, that we start to see the Southernization, if you will, of Civil War memory.
After Lee's death in 1870, General Longstreet's reputation took quite a turn. As a matter of fact, I think he even was on Grant's staff when he was president. What happened to him relative to the reunions? Was he a part of it? Did the Confederate veterans not want him around? What was his position?
Well, he doesn't come in 1887. I mean, that's just members of Pickett's division, although, of course, he would have been the commanding officer. But he's not here in 1887. To my knowledge, and someone please correct me if this is wrong, I don't believe he comes back for any official reunion. No. His wife, his second wife, however, does show up in 1913. By that point, Sally Pickett, who's become incredibly famous and popular by 1913, although her health's not very good, doesn't come to the reunion. So Helen Dortch Longstreet becomes the figure at the 1913, the female figure, if you will, at the 1913 reunion. But as you mentioned, Longstreet becomes a Republican. Jubal Early launches all sorts of tirades against Longstreet and doesn't want him part of the various historical societies, the Association of Army of Northern Virginia. But at the dedication, the 1890 dedication of the Lee statue on Monument Avenue, in Richmond, Longstreet is part of that procession. So he is very much involved in that.
Yes. In the most current issue of Civil War Monitor, there's a picture of Longstreet at the 25th reunion standing with General Sickles, General Slocum.
At the 25th reunion?
Yes.
Pete, you were shaking your head in agreement with me.
Or maybe it was a reunion.
A reunion. Yeah, I don't think he was here in 1888. Maybe what? The 25th reunion?
I think I could have sworn that it says that.
I will have to look for it.
It's in the Civil War Monitor.
In the Monitor. Thank you.
I might be wrong, but that picture is not from a reunion. He happened to be here at the same time there was a group of Union generals and officers meeting here.
Yeah.
They actually ran into each other on Little Round Top, and I think the picture was taken there. I think that's what that article says. So,
okay.
It's in that.
I will look it up. It's that magazine is laying on my desk. I just haven't gotten to it yet.
Were there any organizations like the Freemasons that might have encouraged reconciliation? I'm thinking of the monument of Armistead and Hancock.
Right. I don't know specifically that the Freemasons were involved, but there were lots of organizations that were national organizations that had nothing to do with the Civil War that surely that did encourage reconciliation. There are also lots of business interests that encouraged reconciliation. On the women's side, specifically the Women's Christian Temperance Union was an organization that is popular north and south, initially mostly in northern states, but there's certainly southern representative. Sally Chapman is a very important figure in the southern effort for the WCTU. But even though they encouraged reconciliation in the sense of we can work together on the issue, in that case of temperance, when it came to remembering the Civil War, two totally different things. We'll celebrate our Union ancestors and we'll honor our Confederate ancestors, and we can have discussions on alleviating poverty or dealing with orphanages or any other Gilded Age issue. But when it came to the Civil War, there were plenty of groups that said absolutely no, we have our own distinct memories of the war. It's a great question. All right, thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it.